So what does Ukraine need to win? Like, what has to happen between now and victory? This is a United 24 video where they're going to talk about that with a military expert. He's from the Middle East. He also teaches in Great Britain and has some connections to Ukraine. And his perspective is really, really interesting. So we're going to watch this and we're going to see what Ukraine really needs in order to win. His analysis is fascinating. It takes a little while to ramp up, but at some points he's starting to talk about the difference between what they're doing and what ISIS did. It's really fascinating to watch. Just give it some time. Here we go.
Dear viewers, hello and welcome to another United 24 special. My guest today is Dr. Omar Ashwer, who is a professor of security and military studies at the Doha Institute in Qatar and at the University of Exeter in Great Britain. He's also a senior fellow of the Ilko Kuchenko Democratic Initiatives Foundation here in Kyiv. Dr. Ashwer, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
We have entered one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult phases of the war. I mean, the front line is stagnating with a little exchange of territory, but still hundreds of people dying every single day. What needs to change from the Ukrainian side?
I think for Ukraine,
He said it's one of the most difficult phases of the war. I think short of the initial phase where nobody knew what was going to happen, this is one of the most difficult phases of the war because it's so frustrating to not see the progress in spite of all the effort. And so it's been a difficult season.
I believe Ukraine needs to do more of the same. It will need more Western weapons, and it's already pushing for that. So this is the time for the West to provide what's needed and to listen more, especially in terms of the qualitative training, because many of the training that went before, in terms of combined arms training, was not what Ukraine exactly needed, and the way. How to put it in a diplomatic way, the Western allies have not fought a peer or a near peer enemy since a very long time. When did NATO forces clear trenches in very complex or faces very complex defensive conventional army, well entrenched, and they're trying to do this without air superiority.
Okay, so this was one of his first great points. NATO training was good, but NATO training assumes certain things like superior firepower or the ability to have combined arms or air superiority, things along these lines that the Ukrainians really didn't have. So the training was good, but the training didn't quite fit the situation on the ground.
Parity, when did they do this? And therefore they need to listen more. They need to listen to the military observers from the Ukrainian sides, from the front lines. But Ukraine needs to keep on pushing. There's also one other thing that needs, we can go branch by branch, but in terms of air defenses specifically. So since the Western defense industries are not that much ready to supply large quantities, I think, and Ukraine has a lot of Soviet and Ukrainian systems, S-300s, Buk Ms, others, Tors, others, Sterlas. Many of these, and these munitions, many of it's produced in Russia, right? So Ukraine will need them in terms of the future. So where can you find these stocks? Look in the so-called global south.
Okay, this is one of the reasons, this is great point number 2. This is one of the reasons that I don't think Russia's worried about running out of ammunition. They can just go back to the African warlord that they sold a bunch of nonsense to, pay him more to get some of this back, and that's going to be, I think, the wave of the future. Ukraine has to think the same way. So Ukraine has to woo the same global south countries that Russia is going to go to get the ammunition and get the ammunition, because there's a lot of it out there.
From Vietnam in the east all the way to Algeria in the west, and many Angola, many other countries in the so-called global south have these munition systems. And we're talking here not about hundreds of tons, but probably hundreds of tons, hundreds of thousands of tons in terms of ammunitions and systems. And Ukraine will need to either get those or prevent Russia from acquiring them, because now Russia is having half a million tons, at least 500,000 tons of ammunition coming from North Korea, and Ukraine has.
Now, my understanding is that the North Korean ammunition isn't in that great shape. Maybe it wasn't cared for, or in air-conditioned rooms that weren't going to let it, go corroded. But nonetheless, some ammunition beats no ammunition, and so it's still a better thing than not. I mean, for the Russians, it's still a better thing to have that than not, although it's not that great.
Munition from South Korea, so we're expanding the scope and the scale of the alliances. And in that sense, Ukraine needs more friends as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the Israeli-Palestine conflict that culminated on the 7th October with a terrorist attack by Hamas on the civilian population of Israel, and has now escalated into, we can almost say, a full-scale war and ground operation in Gaza. My question is as to the potential Russian involvement. We have the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Kirill Budanov, who said about the Hamas attack that only someone with experience in this theater of war here in Ukraine would be able to conduct such an attack. And now we also see a Hamas delegation that has traveled to Moscow in the following weeks. And at the same time, Israeli-Russian relations or cooperation on a military level in the Middle East were actually as strong as they hadn't been in a long time. So how do you make sense of it?
Yeah, two things there. First, to put things also in perspective, the Hamas-Russia relationship are much older than 7th of October attacks. So, I think their first meetings officially was in 2006. So, we're talking about over 15 years ago.
After the construction of, or the closing off of the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, exactly. So Gaza Strip was blockaded from all sides, pretty much. So the relations with Russia goes back to that time.
Now that's interesting. It's blockaded from all sides. It's not just blockaded from the Israeli side, but it's also blockaded from the Egyptian side. The Egyptians aren't letting the Palestinians really out of Gaza. Like, they'll let some humanitarian aid in, but the Egyptians don't want them either.
Around 2006, and Putin came out at least once, if not more than once, and says that he does not consider Hamas as a terrorist organization, and therefore he had a relationship with them. So that's one. Two, on the tactics. So it's possible. We don't have...
All right, before we get to the tactics, one of my viewers sent me this. His name was Vince. And Vince, I asked him for permission to talk about this. He said Putin's main excuse for invading Ukraine was that Russian speakers were being discriminated against and being harmed, to the point that the Kremlin was calling Eastern Ukraine a genocide. Putin said Russia went into Ukraine to protect Russian speakers. Approximately 20 to 25% of the population of Israel are Russian speakers, and Putin sides with Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah. So Putin's willing for 2 million or so Russian speakers to put them at risk of being killed by Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. And that's really an interesting point. Like, think about that. Like, so either he doesn't care about these Russian speakers, or he didn't care about those in Ukraine to begin with, and that was a pretext. And I think that's a brilliant point, Vince. Okay, back to our main program here. Let's hear what he had to say.
Confirmations or evidence. The relationship between Netanyahu and Putin was a strong relationship. It was not a bad relationship in a way, pre 7th of October.
So why would Putin invite a Hamas delegation to Moscow at this time? What's his endgame or his strategy there, and how is it connected to Ukraine? Maybe
it's all connected to Ukraine. So the Middle East was pretty much connected to Ukraine since since the Russian intervention in Syria, and even before that. I think Putin is trying to benefit.
And this is what you need to understand. It is all connected to Ukraine, or maybe it's all connected to Russia is a better way of saying that.
From that conflict as much as possible. And he's trying to do so by portraying himself as a anti-colonial, anti-occupation, pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian president who is now suddenly, he's anti-occupation, and
although he's occupying and colonizing his neighbor in Ukraine.
Anti-forced deportation and anti-colonial settlers and what he exactly is doing here in Ukraine, the forced deportation, the occupation, the colonial settlements, and so on. And it's great for him that the media attention is all now focused on the Middle East.
Yep.
So there are some channels that were 24 hours covering Ukraine, with many correspondents here in Ukraine. And now they're completely withdrawn, and the focus is on the Middle East.
Okay, that's his third or fourth grade point. I'm trying to keep up. CNN went from 8% Ukraine coverage on October 6th to now 1% Ukraine coverage because it was displaced by what was going on in Israel.
So therefore, he gets more chance to do whatever he wants there. Also, there's he's that competition on Ukraine and Israel support, for example, by the US, is benefiting him quite well. So he's hoping more and more for the redirection of resources, not just media attention, but also resources in terms of ammunition, in terms of funding, to the conflict in the Middle East. So I think if there's someone who's benefiting immensely from this conflict, it's not really Israel or Hamas or the Palestinians. It's actually Putin.
Russia intervened in the war in Syria in 2015. The Americans also have boots on the ground there. How is the Russian policy or Russian strategy in Syria and the Middle East connected to the war in Ukraine?
It is very, very connected, and we can even go back to pre-2015. So in 2015, multiple things happened. Minsk 2 happened. The Baltva happened here in Ukraine. So the Baltva was, frankly, the most intense conventional battle in East Europe since the Balkans War. And it happened while the negotiations were
and most people aren't even aware of what that was
going on in Minsk 2. And then after that, the Minsk 2 was not respected by the Russian sides. We know that. We know from the records of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
But wait a minute. Every troll I've seen on my website, every troll that has come through said, well, what about Minsk? What about Minsk? The Russians didn't respect Minsk either.
We know the amount of battery exchanges and company-sized firefights that was happening. Some of them exceeded 40 in per day. We have, again, the recordings. When Mr. Putin was speaking to the Obama administration and with the West in terms of the Syria peace plans, you would find almost zero exchanges. So in the Donbass, which was a message that
Zero exchanges of fire.
Zero exchange of fire, no fighting. So these 40+ battery exchanges and company-sized firefights that were happening in the Donbass after Minsk, they would not stop because of Minsk. They were stopping because he had talks with the West about Syria. And you can see the dates exactly. If you put the data with the dates, you will see like high, and then suddenly zero.
Isn't that interesting? Like just how that worked?
It is the zero. When he was speaking about Syria with the West and decided to have his peace plan multiple times there. Also, the Russian security and military planners and the advisor of Putin, I think they see it's this arc between Eastern Europe, Caucasus, Middle East is very well connected. And in many ways, that has been the Russian thinking since the Tsarist era, that this is their backyard, their domain.
Your book, How ISIS Fights, was recently fitted with a new...
Okay, before he goes on and talks about how ISIS fights and the connection between how ISIS fights and what's going on here, this is the way that Russia is seeing this. This is Ukraine is their backyard and Syria is their backyard, and this is part of their sphere of influence, and so that's part of why they're acting as they are.
Prologue called How Putin's Army Fights Like ISIS in Ukraine. That's a bold statement. Explain yourself.
It is. It really is.
Sure. So I'll go back a bit to 2016. I came here for a research project, and I was interviewing some of the soldiers who left Crimea, and they started to explain to me how Crimea fell in the end of the Russian army. And I told them, I heard the story before. Back then, it was the story of Raqqa city in 2013, Syria. What was happening there was a series of senior infiltrations of both the regime and the rebel security structures by ISIS. And so it was a Maskarovka in a way. A series of false front organizations, a series of explosions that were mysterious, and then kidnappings, assassinations of civilian leaders who can influence the population against ISI presence back then. And then also a more or less a series of psychological and information operations.
Exactly.
And after finishing all this, the first time they took Raqqa in September of 2013, they just consolidated by force, by conventional force. They attained the victory by these mix of psychological infiltration, information operations, and a series of terrorist attacks. And then they secured the victory with conventional force. Fast forward to 2014 in Crimea, a series of destabilization operations, false front organizations, more or less attempting to infiltrate or successfully infiltrating security services, and after that trying to secure the victory with one of the largest air assault operations in the history of East Europe after 1945. And then after that, fast forward again to the Donbass, and then you see a series of, so ISIS were masters of IED warfare, of improvised explosive devices warfare. People forget, between January 2014, we have the data, till December 2015, the Russian-led forces in the Russian-led forces in the Donbass used IEDs, including car bombs, over 600 times. So in less than 2
Yeah, and we don't hear much about that. What you usually hear is from trolls that the Ukrainians were trying to beat up on poor Ukrainians in the east, but you don't really hear about this picture. And the connection between the way that ISIS operated and the way that Russia operated, I think, is really significant and ought not to be dismissed. This is a great point.
Years there was so basically a bomb every day, so also and then fast forward to 2022, and you have here, according to the Ukrainian officials, over 18,000 IEDs and ordnance left around in Kyiv Oblast to cover the retrogrades, the retreats of the Russian forces, which is a very ISIS thing to do, but they left them in places like children parks, people's homes, houses, and so on. So just to inflict damage on the population as much as possible. Move on from the IED warfare,
which is called evil, just like this is.
To weaponizing sexual violence.
Yep.
ISIS
More
attempted
evil.
to weaponize rape and sexual violence and to destroy specific communities, including the Yazidis in northern Iraq. And we know the cases here. And the more you dig, the more you found out the amount in terms of the quantity, the sheer scale of sexual violations that happened in occupied territories, especially the liberated territories such as Kherson City, and also abusing religion in a way to weaponize it against the targeted populations. So what ISIS were very clever at is the taking texts, religious texts, out of or verses out of context, and then reinterpreting them, and then using multimedia to more or less sell them as if what they're doing is holy. And then you see what was happening, for example, Patriarch Kirill with giving an icon to General Zolotov, the head of the Rosguardia, more or less legitimating an occupation and blessing the weapons and the soldiers and so on. So abusing religion in a very destructive way.
So on many levels, what ISIS has done was almost a template for what the Russians were doing in Ukraine. And that's a really interesting connection that I had not seen before, but you know what? There's a lot to it.
If you put all this picture together, from the IEDs to the abusing religion to the sexual violence to the infiltration to the put all this and destabilizing and then trying to secure with the conventional weapons. This is how ISIS basically controlled over 120 towns and villages and cities between southern Philippines to Western Africa. It's a very cheap way of warfare, very criminal way of warfare, but very effective way of warfare. If you want to make the comparison, when in Crimea, the Russian army did not lose much. They lost maybe one self-defense, so-called self-defense militiaman, but then controlled and took and occupied and then annexed one of the most geostrategic peninsula of Ukraine. And then when they used conventional, their entire force was destroyed.
Isn't that fascinating? All right, so I thought that this was worth just for hearing about the connection between ISIS, let alone anything else you had to say. All right, so Tell me what you think. Is he on base? Because it seems like he is. It seems like the Russian method of waging war was largely built on a template of what ISIS had done before. And if that's the case, should that change the way that we think about our strategy? All right. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention, the likes, the shares, the subscribes. But thank you most of all for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.